Everyone understands that fully. That's right. That's right. Okay. Thank you, Megan. Oh, sorry, Chris, Councillor Darby.
And just clarification, there's been some documents that were treated as confidential, but they found their way into the public arena, like the EY report, which is fundamental to this discussion. And can I just have assurance that can we assume that we treat that as now a public document, or do we not assume that?
Yeah, same with the confidential motions passed in May last year. I mean, basically they were not confidential within a few months. So.
And what about statements that might have been made by people at a confidential workshop, which builds the case for the funding? Are those statements, are they confidential or are they public?
Look, well, they are, but I mean, I will say I was in a confidential thing and three people went out. It was Chatham House rules and named me as saying X, Y, Z to a reporter. And I mean, what can you do? Hey, you know, so.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. So just checking on from Councillor Darby. So that's a similar situation to the revelation of the identities of the Waterfront Stadium that was made by one council. That's the same principles are going to apply, is it? Just check that. Yeah.
Look, I'm just going to move on. Thank you, Megan. And I'm just going to ask Doug and them to come forward, as it's public input. But can we just respect? It's been a really tough 4 or 5 days in New Zealand. It's a much bigger thing going on around us than a debate over Eden Park, and I've just asked people to please treat it with the appropriate decorum. Let's not get personal. Let's just try and keep it rational. Don't raise voices and everything, and just respect the time that this nation is going through. Welcome, Doug. If you want to introduce your team, please.
Yes, it is a very difficult time for everyone. It feels like this is somewhat peripheral to the issues that the country is dealing with at the moment. But thank you for your time to be here, and thank you for adjusting the agenda to accommodate the conflict that I was managing. I have Vicky Salmon, one of our board and chair of our audit committee, Brett Winstanley, CFO, and Nick Sortner, our CEO, and myself as chair. Be very quick. We've got 5 slides, and we've got a more detailed presentation deck to sit behind that, which I'm not going to address, but will provide more information for you. I'll just talk to the 5 slides of which this is one. I think it's important, as we did at the workshop, but now we're in a different context, I think it is important just to remind us all, because it seems to be so easily forgotten, about the history of this loan. The $40 million loan. And I'm going to paraphrase it, but there was a deal done to upgrade Eden Park for the 2011 Rugby World Cup, where the government would put in $190 million and the then legacy councils of Auckland would put in $50 million. And on that basis, a new trust deed was established in 2009, and on that basis, the trust let a construction contract to Fletcher's to demolish and rebuild the southern stand. So that's the background history to why things happened as they did. And it was envisaged that the park, with no debt and with an operating environment that allowed and supported the revisions to the trust deed, would be financially autonomous. But of course, the world changed. The legacy councils, for different reasons, bar one, and I mentioned that when I was here last time, the ARC and Councillor Mike Lee, acknowledge you once again. The legacy councils reneged on that deal and left the Eden Park Trust with no ability to close the funding gap without somebody's support. And that support was constructed by the trustees and the Auckland City Council at the time as being a loan from the ASB for $40-odd million and backed by a guarantee. The only way that the ASB would provide that money was if the council backed it with a guarantee. So we find ourselves now, all of us, dealing with a legacy issue that's 10 years old, and has never been resolved to the complete satisfaction of the people that have been left carrying the debt. And that is the reason why we find ourselves here today. We have borne the cost of that debt at the park since 2010. The cumulative interest bill on that 10 years debt is over $15 million. If we were not landed with that debt, we would not be here today. We would have had $15 million more to spend on ensuring the park is where it needs to be. The resolutions do have acknowledged the need for capital support, the second half of the resolutions, but they are via way of a loan. And I would make the point very early on that we do not find ourselves in a position as to being able to increase our indebtedness at the park. So a loan would not be a suitable mechanism for us. We are indebted now, and the EY report makes that very clear, as do some of the comments in the background to this paper. And we believe that a grant, if you are to consider doing anything to help us today, that a grant is essential. The Trust has more debt than is fiscally prudent already, and therefore to agree to take on more debt that we are unlikely to be ever able to repay is not a liability that my fellow trustees and myself are prepared to take. I find this issue of financial prudence bouncing around in the public forum, but I find that it's one very narrow definition of financial prudence. And in the context of this paper, giving Eden Park, say, $10 million over the next 3 years would not be a financially prudent thing to do, is what I hear people say. I'm not sure those people know about the history of how we ended up where we are. Some of them do know it, but continue to say they should sort it out for themselves. And we need to keep them under pressure. Well, we don't need any more pressure than we've got. Bring it on if you want. We will handle the pressure that comes our way. But putting a community organisation under pressure, I don't think, is a very friendly stance to imply in a public domain. I, as a businessman, sit here, and as a banker, sit here and say, what is financially imprudent about helping council avoid spending up to $482 million over the next 10 years and creating the 10 to 15 year space for you to seriously consider if and when a new stadium might be on the cards, wherever that may be. In the world of massive infrastructure, delaying things by a year and getting more out of the infrastructure you've got is a very, very important improvement on the financial situation of an organisation. So I would like to broaden the definition of financial prudence, and I would venture that granting Eden Park, say $10 million, to avoid spending $482 million plus and $91 million at Western Springs would be a very financially prudent decision. The other area I'd like to touch on are the areas of fairness, precedent, policy, and best practice. On fairness, I would refer, I think it's point 53 in the paper, which I'm sure you've all read, but a funding loan is not consistent with how other facilities in Auckland are funded. And there's also a comment there is currently no prospect of a loan being repaid from operating revenue. We agree with both those points. In terms of precedent, I refer to point 51. There's a very fulsome discussion around organisations that are supported and the policy that supports that funding. And it concludes that there has primarily been grant funding for operational and capital expenditure for other community entities. But that doesn't seem to be the case in our resolutions here today. Point 50, the Facilities Partnership Policy Matrix, refers to typical investment in facility partnerships as being by way of one-off or ongoing grants, contract and operating subsidies for CapEx and OpEx. And I'll also refer to the precedent for your own stadium organisation, RFA, and how much grant support they get for various operating and capital priorities. And we are having to go and compete with them in a market where we're funding everything that we are able to improve at the park, plus rates, plus interest, plus insurance. And the best practice piece, I would refer to the Office of the Auditor General's Good Practice Guide of 2006, written by that venerable OAG at the time, Mr. Kevin Brady. And this is about principles to underpin management by public entities of funding to non-government organisations. And section 3.31 talks about sustainability of the funding relationship. And it says, a public entity should not exploit its negotiating position where there is only one potential supplier. Section 3.35 deals with the issue of fairness. Public entities have a fundamental public law obligation to always act fairly and reasonably. And section 3.38, monitoring effectiveness. The public entity needs to monitor the effects of its funding initiatives. And in that, if that means Eden Park if we are a recipient of your support, we will gladly accept, absolutely accept that accountability and come back and report to you as to what we've done with any funding. And section 3.41 talks about imbalance of power. The public entity and the NGO have different amounts of power in the relationship. And, quote, to be fair and reasonable, the public entity should consider this power imbalance in a way in which it conducts the relationship. Slide 4. Venue strategy. Let me say how glad we are, how ecstatic we are to finally be part of a venue strategy from this council. We support the partnership approach to operational management and strategic development of Auckland Stadium assets, and we will engage along with RFA in that process as this unfolds. I would say, and I'd like to make this point to a few who might think otherwise, that supporting Eden Park, in my mind, does not mean no new stadium nor the end of Mount Smart. We see, and I've talked to Chris Brooks about this, we see a scenario where with better management of the network of stadiums we have in the city, including Eden Park, we can choose and work to encourage hirers to the best fit for purpose stadium facility for their activity. And I'd give an example of that wonderful match at Mount Smart last year, Rugby League Australia versus Tonga. Whereas I understand it, 20,000 potential fans missed out because of the inherent limitation of Mount Smart for that size event. That was an event that RFA, the Warriors, and ourselves could have worked on to hold at Eden Park and given 20,000 more fans an experience. And that just got lost in the boundaries between the various organisations, to the people of Auckland's detriment. We would remind members that Eden Park hosts both local, regional and national events, and not often publicised, and we don't choose to talk about it very much, but we are also part of the capacity to act for civil defence in Auckland for the police and other agencies. So it's very important we are able to keep up some of our critical infrastructure in the event that we need the park. So, my last slide. We cannot accept the resolutions as they stand, and so if I say that to you, then the next question you'd ask me is, well, what would you prefer? And I've put 3 options up there in descending order of preference by us. The first is that you would forgive the existing debt and recognising the history of the debt, and grant 3.2 million each year for 3 years to support us in some of the essential works we have to do at the park. The second is make the existing debt interest-free and grant us $3.2 million each year for 3 years. And the third, but least preferred, but I understand there's a lot of pressures on a lot of people in this room, take over the existing debt on the same general terms and grant 3.2 million each year for 3 years. So I would put those options up to help a constructive discussion here today. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Doug. I'll lead off. I have 3 questions. You were quoting Kevin Brady with some edicts or whatever. You indicated that we were the sole supplier. Wouldn't you agree the government is also an existing supplier? Certainly they stumped up 190 million 7 or 8 years ago, and Auckland Council, ARC 10 million and Auckland Council loaned 40. Isn't the government still a potential supplier to you?
They are potentially, in the fact that we do support national initiatives, so they have a role to play, but they've made their policy very clear, and I think that is a conversation I would be wanting to have with the government in a year or two's time, or maybe earlier actually. They will support events, but they will not support capital infrastructure. And we have some, I don't know whether you've caught up with the news, but we have some very big events coming to the park, and the most exciting one where I think we would look for government support, there's 3 of them, Rugby World Cup for women, Cricket World Cup for women, and recently Te Matatini will come to Auckland in 2021, which is just amazing.
I just want to clarify for the public record that there is another supplier. We are not the only supplier, therefore we're not applying onerous pressure on you through being the sole supplier. That's all I want agreement on. Thank you. And we struggled recently to adopt the venue development strategy. I'm reading from your slides that the In-Park Trust Board think the present or the new one, the 2019 February venue development strategy is a good strategy. Is that true?
To be honest, the thing that excites us is Eden Park finally gets recognised and gets the respect I think it needs and deserves in a document from RFA on stadium strategy. That is the point that leaves us feeling very good. As to which stadium strategy, I'm still a little confused. There's a January one. We've been asked by Mr. Town to comment on a May one. So we have no idea at this point which one is the real one, but they both highlight Eden Park, so that's good enough for us.
So as long as you're in it, you're endorsing it. Thank you. And then the other one, we've obviously, suggested in the resolutions in the paper a limited recourse loan because it's a way of realising the benefits of both grant and loan funding. Given it's interest-free, have you got legal advice to say that, it's strong legal advice to say that it would be inappropriate or illegal or potentially tip you into insolvency or put trustees at risk of taking on a further loan and effect, because just pointing out that it's interest-free, it's effectively not to be paid unless Eden Park gets wound up. So have you got strong legal advice to say it's inappropriate?
I don't have legal advice as I sit here today, but I'm an experienced business person. We've got people on our board who are very experienced in this space. And if you look at Section 136 of the Companies Act, we have to act in certain ways when it comes to putting the organisation at financial risk. And trustees would be held to a higher account than directors, that I do know. The Eden Park Trust Deed outlines the trustees' responsibilities under Clause 6.1 to be prudent, in the manner and the care and the diligence and skill with which we take on financial liabilities. And the Trustees Act 1956 has duties of certain people to exercise special skills. So those of us who are financially literate and aware, we have a particular obligation to do the right thing financially. So that is what's guiding any personal liability that we individually or collectively would take on as trustees.
Do you think there's a subtle difference in the fact that to be financially autonomous is an objective in your trustee rather than compatible with the Companies Act? I mean, because it is an objective more than anything, isn't it?
Well, when the trust deed was written, and we had this debate at the workshop, financial autonomy was in sight. It was in sight. The park would host a successful Rugby World Cup in 2011 and come out of that debt-free. But that never transpired. So the words of the trust deed were never able to be given effect to because of the actions of some of the legacy councils here in Auckland at that time.
Councillor Newman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mackay. I've got a couple of questions, a couple of microphones. You've quoted from the Principles for Good Management of Public Resources, the Office of the Auditor General. You quoted 3.31, 3.35 and 3.41. I'm just wondering if you have, maybe my hearing's gone, if you've also read 3.32, quote, a public entity should take into account the possible effects of its funding decisions on the number of NGOs available to supply a particular service and on their ability to deliver it. In the second sentence, a public entity needs to fund an NGO at a rate that is fair and reasonable and sufficient to sustain the effective service delivery for the term of the arrangement and not jeopardise long-term delivery prospects. So it'd be your summation that the recommendations in the report tabled by the officers contradict that and would compromise Eden Park's ability to deliver its product?
Yes. In the event that the loan would only get paid back should we be insolvent and be folded, it doesn't seem very compelling to me as a trustee. We cannot afford the debt we've got, and putting more on top is just not palatable.
The report that we are considering today reflects the resolutions of an in-committee report resolved in May last year. Are you familiar that the argument that was put up at the time to justify the recommendations that were subsequently voted in May?
We're getting a problem with the speaker.
You turn yours off and he turns his off, and I'll speak, and that's all good. Yep.
We're going to have to do that, I think.
Talked about, so the arguments that were put up in May talked about a proposed grant option recommended in May last year. Are you familiar with the narrative of that report that says, under the proposed options, Council's contribution may be less? Depending on the performance of the Eden Park Trust Board, Council will have greater ability to influence Eden Park Trust Board under the alternate. In other words, if you get the grant to provide you with the facility to get through some of the debates that are coming up, as well as address your immediate renewals, does the Eden Park Trust Board have the capacity with its management to make money to wipe its face so that you can stand with a degree more certainty rather than just simply being reliant on the support that this council may or may not provide?
We are working very diligently to try and achieve the outcome you've described, Councillor Newman. And sometimes it's hard to explain or convince that things are as good as they could possibly be given the current situation we operate in. But I am confident this board and management team are operating as best we can, and we are operating in a lot better fashion than we ever have done with our financials and with our community. The next, and we're not to go there today, so I'm not going to go there, but the next step up is the ability to hold other types of events, and we are working on that.
And my one final question for you is in relation to the report itself, which I believe contains some errors. But the primary error that I have is really the narrative around what Eden Park has requested. I'm not sure if what you've said today indicates that you haven't requested these recommendations. So what ownership do you have of the narrative and the recommendations, or is this something that is foreign to you?
It's not foreign to me. We own the problem. So our ownership is we've got the problem, and we are coming to our friends to see if who helped us have helped us in the past to see if they can be of assistance today. But they are not our resolutions. No, I am aware of the May 15 resolutions, which have not been given effect to, and these are quite a comeback from what those resolutions were as I read them. But I understand there might have been another angle to those resolutions, and we needed support from other people at the same time. And that not being forthcoming, people have been working on alternatives. We engaged with the council on this because frustratingly a year ago, as the debate around a new stadium swirled and got people all excited, misinformation was put out there in the community about Eden Park and its financial state. We published a few months ago a fact sheet on Eden Park which tried to address, and I think every one of you has probably seen that, some of this misinformation. And some I went to see the Mayor about, because the Mayor was talking about Eden Park needs $250 million over the next 10 years, and we had no input to that number, and the Mayor was advised that from other sources. So then we were asked, well, what do you need to ensure Eden Park is viable? And based on our depreciation, we needed $87 million over 10 years. And we came back with a cut-down version of not everything, but the things that were essential in our view, and we've come up with $65 million over 10 years. And so that is our input to this discussion. The other thing that happened was the council advised ASB Bank that on the termination of the loan in September 2019, the council would not be renewing its guarantee. So ASB advised us that they would not be in a position to renew the loan. Quietly, I was happy about that, because if we could resolve the loan and return it to the council in some way, shape or form, that's where it belonged, and that would get us all working from the same page.
Okay, we're going to have to run these speakers, so normally this one stays on, but we're going to have to go one speaker at a time until we get this fixed. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Mackay, thank you very much. Can you please confirm that Mrs. Salmon has been one of your directors involved in discussions with council staff around the terms of potentially what the both two organisations could do?
Yes, I'm deeply grateful to Vicky's support for those conversations. Myself and Nick and Brett have been actively engaged with different parts of the organisation, trying to land a set of resolutions that we could find acceptable.
So then my next question is to Mr. Salmon, if that's all right. Mr. Salmon, you're aware of the May 2018 resolutions. Is it your understanding, or am I correct in my understanding, that you have been talking to council staff about delivering on those resolutions?
Yes, we were up to a certain point, up to late last week, and then the resolution and the paper changed to a non-recourse loan. So at the early part of our discussions, we were talking about a grant with detail around it, with the capital expenditure. And as a board and a management team, we were satisfied with that. And it was late last week that it went to a non-recourse loan, which changed the nature of the discussions.
So I just want to confirm that up to this point, saying it went from May right through to March, that you were under the impression that a voted on resolution from this council as an agreement of how we were going to handle the inverted commas problem, the solution for that you were happy with, the council staff were telling you were happy with, and only at the end of last week did that change. Is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, we agreed with the council staff that we would go to 3 years and not 10 as a change to the resolution of May, taking into account council's planning cycles. So that was the minor change, was instead of a 3.2 over 10 years, it was going to be 3.2 as over 3 years.
I suppose my final question, and I'm trying to keep all this very positive and open and pleasant. How did that make you feel when the ball game got changed literally a few days ago?
Well, it was kind of disappointing because we've had a good, strong discussions and relationship with the team at council, and of course we had to advise all of our trustees, and but we wanted to come back and work through it because we still believe that with all the work we've done over the weekend, that a grant is still possible, that we want to work with a partnership relationship with the council, and we could feel really disappointed in that approach, but we want to make some change here today and hopefully get some discussion going on a change back to the May 15 resolution.
Thank you very much, and thank you for positivity.
As a supplementary to that, so you've come up with 3.2, but last year, before the May resolution, which we passed in confidential, the request from Eden Park was 6.4 per year for 10 years. And now it's half. Is there a basis for that?
I understood that basis was well understood by the people in the room at the time.
Okay. Yeah, but say the 64 came from Eden Park Trust Board. Mayor Goff.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Thank you for your presentation, Doug. You quoted to us Section 136 of the Companies Act, which said that you can't put yourself at financial risk. Can you explain to me, please, because I don't understand, why you'd be putting yourself at financial risk to accept a limited recourse loan that had A, no interest, B, no final date for repayment, but simply said that if you liquidated your assets, then the investment that the ratepayer has made in you would come back to the ratepayer. How does that actually add to your costs or put you in any financial risk?
We would be adding more debt to the debt burden we already have. By doing so, we would be, by implication, taking a position that the existing debt we have is manageable with more on it. Now, none of us were party to that existing debt, and we're not going to put ourselves in a position where we would be.
I'm sorry, I still don't understand. You're being offered $63 million out of the ratepayers' money. 9.8 million of that is a limited recourse loan, no interest rate, so no financial pressure on you. You get the money, you can do what you want to do, but there's no pressure on you and you don't have to repay any interest. 2, there's no set date for the repayment of that loan, and the understanding is it would only be repaid if you decided to liquidate your assets, which you're entitled to do as a board, in which case the ratepayer, having invested, and we're not really just talking about, 3.2 million a year, where, there'll be an ongoing request. I think you and I both understand that. So the sum could add up to quite a sum of money. But why shouldn't the ratepayer have protection in the event of your disposal of the asset of Eden Park to get its investment in you back? What principle is there that says we should not, as a governing body, be protecting the interest of the ratepayer in that way?
Well, Mr. Mayor, you know more about the detail of the terms of the facility than I do, because I haven't seen the detail of the terms that would be proposed. What I was trying to communicate was we are already overly indebted with the debt we have, and by adding more debt to it, we are taking on the personal liability of the total debt of Eden Park. We inherited the total debt, so we cannot be held accountable for servicing that existing debt, and if we add to it, then by implication, we are saying we believe the park can service the full debt amount. Now, we don't believe that is necessarily true. We are at risk of exogenous factors beyond our control having quite a material impact on what is a relatively sensitive financial situation.
So, sorry to, through you, Mr. Chairman, to persist in this, but you said you didn't know the terms of it, but it's set out in recommendation B that there's no interest payable, that we would want security over the asset of it, but the funding would only be repayable in the event of a significant disposal of Eden Park assets. So it's not really putting you under any financial pressure. It's not costing you any money. This is free money that most of us would kill for if that term was extended to our own mortgage. It's designed to help you, but it's designed to protect the ratepayer that we all have to represent collectively here. Because if, say, just hypothetically, if you decided that you wanted to sell Eden Park in 10 years' time and you'd built up, could easily be $10, $15 million in debt, that we would at least have the protection for the ratepayer's investment to get back rather than that money simply being available to your beneficiaries. Well, to most ratepayers, that would seem to be fair.
I think I've explained how we think about it, Mr. Mayor, but I struggle to see why we'd be different from MOTAT, from ASB Tennis Arena, from Hyundai Marine Sports Centre. No, well, I don't know what you're asking me because I've answered the question. You keep asking me the same question.
My question's very simple. Why should we not fulfil our responsibility to protect the ratepayer's investment in this facility if you decide to sell it up?
Well, that's for you to decide. What I'm telling you from our position is, my opinion is that we are overly indebted as a park, and we are not going to do anything that makes that situation worse or indeed increases our liability for previous decisions that were not ours.
Just to follow up on what you said, Doug, I mean, Clause 54 makes it fairly clear that often some of the examples you're quoting is where the council actually owns the land. We actually have no ownership rights at all over anything to do with Eden Park. So we have Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Just going back a bit of the history. History in New Zealand has big gaps in it, and I feel like there's some gaps in your history that you've conveyed as well. The 40 million, my understanding that back in 2010, and I've sourced the resolutions from the Auckland City Council, it was considered then by John Wally, your predecessor, as a bridging loan. Are you aware of that part of the history as well, that it was a bridging loan with a termination period?
I can't say I am specifically of that technicality, no.
Another predecessor of yours, Rob Fisher, he was in another role at that time, and he said Eden Park has a sustainable business plan that will not require ongoing subsidisation from central or local government. In your role today, are you aware of that part of history as well?
Well, to get the loan from the ASB, I would imagine they would have to demonstrate some level of sustainability. But what they wouldn't have been able to demonstrate is that that loan could never be repaid.
Well, that's what was said then. That's what was promised then. Look, I'll just go on. I have a question. You raised this point about being financially prudent. that's not actually what your deed says. Your deed says you're required to administer your assets on a prudent commercial basis so that the Eden Park is a successful, financially autonomous organisation. So can you tell me, since 2010 to current today, when, if at all, was Eden Park financially autonomous? At what point was it financially autonomous?
Councillor Darby, you have misunderstood what I was talking about with financial prudence. I was not referring to Eden Park. I was referring to the commentary in the public domain from about the council's perception of what financial prudence looks like. And the point I was making was I cannot see anything imprudent about advancing Eden Park $10 million to provide capital avoidance or relief on $482 million and $91 million that I've seen in the public domain. That is the commentary on financial prudence. I'm well aware of our trustee, which says, and you raised this previously, that we need to be financially autonomous. I do believe I've told you the history of how financial autonomy got into the trustee and what were the assumptions at the time it was written. Those assumptions proved not to be correct. The park started its life post-2009 indebted, which was not one of the ingoing assumptions.
So look, I'll just go again. I asked, at any point in the Trust's modern history since the amendments to the legislation, has the Trust been financially autonomous as per that section 4 of the deed?
In 2017, our EBITDA was $6 million. What comes out below $6 million is interest costs and depreciation. Now, interest costs were not assumed in the financial autonomy piece in the trust deed. So we are $6 million EBITDA prior to interest and depreciation. And of course, depreciation shot through the roof when we took on $250 million more of the South Stand redevelopment for the purposes of hosting New Zealand's Rugby World Cup. In 2018, with a drop-off in revenue as events mix and change over time, our EBITDA was $3.8 million. So we have EBITDA of 3.8 and 6. Let me compare that with Waitakere Stadium EBITDA last year, a loss of 300,000. QBE, a loss of 800,000. Mount Smart, a small surplus of 700,000 for a total loss for RFA stadiums of 400,000. We are making 6 million or 3.8 million by comparison to your own stadium network. That's like, to me,
I'm pretty much like the Mayor. I asked a direct question and you've taken me on this wonderful roller coaster journey and you have not answered. So I'm going to assume that not in the modern history since the Rugby World Cup has there been financial autonomy.
How do you define financial autonomy?
Well,
because I define it as EBITDA. I've told you we made $6 million and $3.8 million EBITDA the last 2 years.
And so I'll just take that point then, because then I'll go to another part of the deed, which is section 7, which requires you to apply your income to expenses, including charges and provisions. Provisions also include depreciation. And what you refer to there excludes the setting aside for depreciation, does it not?
We have no capacity for depreciation.
Does it not exclude, Mr. Mackay?
Is this an inquisition? Okay. Is this an inquisition?
Okay, right. We're just going just through the chair. The chair is speaking. The chair. Thank you, Councillor Lee. Okay, can we just address everything through the chair? That's all I ask of everyone. Just address it through the chair, please.
Mr. Chair, I would like the questions, the Mayor's questions, my questions. I might be sounding a bit agitated. The questions are not being answered.
Well, I think they are. You might not think that, but I do. And
it would be most unfortunate if I end up having to call a 5-minute recess when we're having a presentation. So can we just all pull it in, pull our heads in, keep calm, reflect the situation in New Zealand. This is minor. Through the chair, we have Councillor Watson.
One question.
Councillor Darby, one more question.
So look, probably a question that I need to ask in your annual report, in the auditor's part of the report, there is concern raised by the auditor about whether you are a going concern. The EY financial projections, which we asked to have undertaken, EY also expressed concern about your ability to be an ongoing concern, a going concern. In your view today, do you satisfy the description of being a going concern? And ultimately, do you consider yourselves to be solvent today?
We are solvent, definitely. That is not a concern for me. The solvency test for us is, can we service the debt we have today? And right now we can. And we have demonstrated an ability to do that for the last 10 years.
Are you a going concern?
I'm not technically sure what the going concern term means. I know what solvency means. Do you want to offer anything on that, Brett?
We are a going concern. A brief definition of a going concern is a business that's capable of meeting its debts and obligations as they fall due. We have the capacity to do that. The cliff edge for us is 30 September. If we don't resolve the situation today with respect to the loan, then things change. There's a whole sequence of events that take place. We are most definitely a going concern. We have been a going concern throughout the history of my involvement with the trust, the new trust, since 2010. There's no question we have the ability to meet our debts as and when they fall due. We've never made a late payment with respect of interest. We've never breached a banking covenant. I can give you an absolute assurance that we are a going concern today.
But Watson, Bartley, Wayne Walker and Councillor Newman will take, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just on the question of history, Doug, I'd just like to check my recollection of the time, if that's correct, because I was a die-hard rugby league follower at that time, wasn't paying as much attention to the World Cup as perhaps I should have been. My recollection of the whole building program at Eden Park was that it was a requirement of the International Rugby Board that work be done in order for New Zealand to be able to host the finals, i.e. if this work was not done, New Zealand would not be hosting that World Cup. Is my recollection correct?
Yes, the minimum requirement at that stage for hosting a Rugby World Cup was the ability to have 60,000 spectators at an event.
Thank you. In terms of that rather remarkable figure you quoted of interest payments over the last decade or less of $15 million, which of course is significantly in excess of what you're coming to us for today. Has someone done a calculation from within the trust what the interest rate would be, or what interest you'll be paying according to the recommendation? That is, council's cost of funds plus a margin. I'm quite curious to know what that interest payment would be, especially in light of the fact that $15 million of interest has already been paid in recent time.
I'll ask our CFO to respond to that question.
So if I understand the question correctly, you'd want to know what it would be if it was at the council's rate of interest. Is that correct?
Sorry, at what's proposed here, and that's the council's cost of funds plus a margin.
For the $40 million?
Yes.
Okay. It would be around about 1.5, a little under $1.5 million a year. That would be an estimate of the cost. It would be in today's against today's rates, we would be in a position to save about $160,000 a year of interest.
Okay, so that's a relatively small saving of what you're paying already. I guess my concern is, and I'll be interested in your response to it, is in terms of funding these improvements to the ground, and I assume we're talking about here turf replacement, turf maintenance, floodlights. So fundamental upgrades, facilities, maintenance that enable you to function. They're not luxury items. I'm really, and I'm sure people of Auckland, having heard this today, if it's reported, why has the trust not fronted up to, I guess, council, given that it was the responsibility of the legacy councils in this interim of the decade, asking for that loan to be written off, given the substantial impact it's been having on your operations?
Well, I've been the chair for just coming up to 3 years, so I can only speak for that time. I can't speak for the people before me, but I did start actively, given my history and knowledge of the processes here, I did start actively engaging on behalf of the trust with the council. The mayor has given me 3 or 4 different opportunities to talk to him about Eden Park, and we formalised a request for some support to replace the turf back in late 2017, not long after I became the chair. So we did start a discussion at that point, but I'm not aware that anybody came to the council prior to that.
Right, it's been pointed out to me we've actually gone past time for this, but I'm just going to make a decision to do it anyway. So we've got, but if we could just be brief, Councillor Bartley, Wayne Walker Newman, Casey, and Chris Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, and thank you for your for being here today. I just wanted to ask about your provision of appropriate reserves for capital works sufficient to meet anticipated repairs, refurbishment, etc. in your trust deed, noting your financial statement of financial position. Thank you.
There is a small provision within our balance sheet for emergency funds for repairs and maintenance or capital works. We put aside figures of around $200,000 to $400,000 on an annual basis. That money is in deposit in a separate account, a maintenance reserve account, and that is our backstop should we be in a position where there is an immediate failure of a critical piece of infrastructure. It's a fairly modest balance of about $1.3 million today, but we do address that issue each year, and to the extent that we're capable, from any cash surpluses, we have placed money on reserve.
Thank you. If I could just add to that, do you think that's appropriate given the amount of your, assets?
No, it's not appropriate. Every year we have a depreciation amount of $7 to $8 million, so it only covers 6 weeks of depreciation. But we have to do what we can with any surplus that we are able to create, and that's all we've been able to do.
So I've got a question first about the opportunity cost. And by that I mean the cost saving to ratepayers from effectively a modest investment in Eden Park as compared to further investment in regional facilities. And quite obviously you identify the $482 million plus the $91 million, which is $550 million. That's more than $500 million. That is simply a capital requirement. My calculation, based on a conversation with Matthew Walker, at a very conservative 6%, that's 3% interest, 3% depreciation, is that's $30 million a year in operational spend that the council would otherwise be spending. So that's $550 million of ratepayers' money plus $30 million per year. Obviously, it's not going to kick in straight away, but that's what we're talking. If I then apply that, and this comes to my question, around Council's facility partnership policy. And there are some principles there around investing strategically.
Councillor Walker, just get to the question. You're almost
I'm being
there.
much
You're almost
quicker
there.
than Councillor Darby, Mr. Chair.
Oh, he
Much
had-
quicker.
he had
And you let
questions.
him engage for some time. So am I going to have the same respect from the chair?
I'm the chair and I'll decide. I'm asking you to get closer to the question.
So
that's all.
I'm trying to, Mr. Chair. So going to my question, and I'm raising this question because it has not been adequately addressed in the agenda item, so I'm referring to the facilities partnership policies around investing strategically, wisely, equitably and sustainably. And then I'm referring that to the items on your list, for example, that include gender appropriate changing rooms for women, turf replacement, items that go to resilience around
Councillor Walker,
CCTV upgrades.
I'm going to give you
and
one
the
more
like.
chance to ask a question. We're now getting
So,
into gender toilets.
Do you
Come on.
do you think that the investment on the part of the ratepayers of Auckland into your facility meets those criteria in the facilities partnership policy?
Yes, I do. And it would enable the park to be functioning well, safely, and delivering a quality experience to the patrons, the people of Auckland, for the next 10 to 15 years.
And if I go to a particular point, and it's around resilience, and that goes to civil defence, it goes to security, that may be something I'd suggest that's considerably elevated. That goes to batteries, CCTV cameras and the like. Do you consider that to be imperative?
Councillor Walker, I'll address that. Obviously, under point 43, there was some discussion around essential and non-essential items. Sadly, in New Zealand, as we all know, the country changed on Friday. One of the things that I pride myself on is the fact that we do have a facility that is safe for our patrons, and our facilities do need to continue to be upgraded. We do have CCTV requirements, 120 cameras within the facility do need to be upgraded. We have 50 turnstiles that require upgrading, and also all our emergency evacuation gates. So those items are critical to ensure the safety of over 500,000 patrons a year.
And the other question just goes to a comparison, Mr. Chair, and it goes to some of the questions being asked. And in particular, it goes to another charitable trust, which is Regional Facilities Auckland. The magnitude of its operational losses on a yearly basis, the magnitude of the capital injections.
1.7.2c, the matter discussed is not the matter currently before the meeting. We're not discussing one of our CCOs.
I had one other question, Mr. Chair.
Just a comment first, Doug. I think if you'd been wearing your former chief executive's hat, your answers to some of the questions today might have been quite different. My question, I've got two. They're from your current website. And the first is a comment, and I'm quoting from your website as it exists today. Eden Park remains an underutilised public facility due in no small part to Auckland Council's role as a regulator by way of setting consent conditions and competitor in the form of RFA, who operate all other major stadiums of Auckland. Regardless of what we do today, how does that change? That doesn't change, does it? That's my question. Yes or no?
Because another part of the resolutions, which we do agree with and would support, is to work more in partnership with RFA and Auckland Council. And so I think the world would change if that was the case. But that's going to require us and RFA in particular to change a lot. But if we can make those changes, then there could be some very different outcomes.
Thank you for that answer. My second one relates to rugby and cricket and what you intend to do to increase their contribution to pay for things like your new turf. So what's your plans for them?
We get support from a lot of charitable entities as it stands today, various trusts and so on. Auckland Cricket and Auckland Rugby are not in the position to make any serious dent in our debt situation. They've already lent us some money, which we have not been able to repay. It's sitting in our balance sheet. They are two beneficiaries of the trust, along with the people of the region. So I'm not quite sure what you're looking for there, Councillor, but they're not in a position to support us significantly with financing. No increase in? No.
Thank you.
Right, I have Councillor Fletcher, Filipina, Councillor Lee, and then Councillor Newman as a repeat, perhaps. So,
well, Mr. Chairman, I really welcome the degree of interrogation on this, and I think it's really healthy. My question, to a degree, has already been asked by Councillor Walker, but I wanted to understand right now what is really required in terms of ensuring the health and safety of Aucklanders utilising the facility, because I think that is something that everybody would expect that we would have considered properly in any request, especially if we are looking at future partnerships from the Council with RFA and yourself.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Fletcher. As I mentioned earlier, our priorities, and we've had a number of meetings with whether it be police or security services following the events of last week, our priorities will be reviewed in terms of where we spend and the areas that we are required to look to reinvest. You'll see within the list under point 43 that our venue control room and our monitoring equipment is included within that list, and we'll ensure that that is reviewed in light of the current circumstances.
I might say, Councillor, the disaster scenario for me personally would be one of 2 or 3 high priority things. And it would be a disaster for us, and it would be a disaster for the city. One would be the turf just cannot cope anymore, and we're on global TV and the turf becomes a problem and is a danger to the players. The other sorts of things that could happen that would worry me and do worry me continuously are the lights are aged, and if they chose, not to function one night, and there was a very sort of high-profile cricket bash at the Gabba, I think it was, where the lights went out. We don't want that happening to Auckland. Things like elevators. We don't want goods and people stuck in elevators. And the elevators have been around a long time. They're well serviced, and we've got a regime that we follow diligently. But things get old. Lesser priorities I can talk to you about as well, but those are the things that any funding support would go straight to. They would be the number 1, 2, 3 priorities that we would work on.
okay, Councillor Filipina.
Tēnā rā koutou katoa to everybody up there. Hey, look, Doug, I'm just going to ask a few questions around the loans and the overdraft that you currently have, and just getting some totals based on what we've got in the agenda. So there's apparently a $7 million working capital fund that Impact have?
That's correct.
And what's owing on that currently?
That is currently drawn not to zero. There are no drawings on that balance. So that balance began at 7.138 million when the $40 million loan came into place. So over the period of 9 years from that time, we have fully repaid that facility. It is redrawable, but it is currently drawn to zero.
Okay, so that. Nothing's owed on it? Cool bananas.
But Councillor, we would be looking for that facility to be reinstated.
I understand.
It's an emergency facility, and it is part of why I can sit here today and say I believe we are solvent. And
overdraft facility?
That simply covers us overnight if we fail to receive funds we might be expecting and we have obligations we need to meet. So it's an overnight facility, and it hasn't been utilised recently.
And the last on the 6.5, that was the 1999 loan. I'm assuming, in reading the report, that still is sitting there.
Correct. So that's a loan that's owed to the council, not to the bank.
Yeah, not the ASB. Doug, when you first started, and you mentioned the loans, and you then went to the options, and I got a wee bit confused when Councillor Simpson asked questions around it. Now, are you saying that the $40 million, are you saying that your request is to have that as a grant, and that we give you the 40 million? So that's what I was getting confused about. So I just want to get that question answered, please.
The grant term has been used, I think, in most people's minds to apply to the annual amount of money for 3 years. The loan term should be used for the existing debt.
Thank you, because the grant term has actually been banded around for the 40 million as well.
Right.
So that's why I wanted to get clarification around that. No, it's a loan. And I remember, Doug, if you recall, the question I asked, that if it is a loan and a decision is made, that if the assets are sold, and I remember that asking the question, will that 40 million come back to Auckland Council? And I'm assuming the answer is still the same.
The answer is yes, because the loan is securitised over the assets of the trust.
And just one more question, Chair. Doug, in regards to your options up there, why 3.2? I mean, I recall that you said from 2021, it's in the report, that depending on what happens, I'm not going to raise the question around resource consent, but post 2021, you're looking at about $2 to $3 million, depending on how things go around the consenting. So is this why it's now 3.2? And your thoughts on the 9.8 that's currently in the agenda recommendations over a 3-year period? Just want to get your view on that, please.
My understanding is the 3.2 was the amount that the council previously had approved to commit in the May 15 resolutions, and that was for a 10-year period. And that ended up being half of the $64 million that we came back and said, this is the minimum we need to keep the place running over 10 years. Now, part of, as Vicky said, part of the thing that changed a couple of weeks ago in talking to council officers was 3 years versus 10 years. And in the spirit of trying to manage what is not an easy situation for any of us, and I, more than any, would appreciate the pressures that you as councillors and mayor are under in terms of the financial situation, I'm willing to support 3 years versus the previous resolution approved at 10, because 3 years gives us time to work through the consenting situation, and I won't go into any more detail. We're about to start on that. And the other thing it does is it gives RFA time to get through the immediate priorities in their budget, and maybe we can all think about from year 4 on, what's in RFA's budget that assumed they would be spending 482 million and 91 million and more, that then could be possibly redirected to Eden Park. So I'm willing to trust that we could have an adult conversation in 3 years' time about that.
And sorry, it's your last question. It's on number 48, Doug, and you mentioned several times when you answered some of the questions from the councillors is that number 48 is closer cooperation between Eden Park Trust, Auckland Council and RFA. So I'm assuming, Doug, that that's definitely something that you and the Trust and Eden Park will support.
That is a given, councillor. You have our absolute commitment
Okay.
that we would work hard to make that real.
Okay, I have Councillor Lee who hasn't asked a question, and then I have Councillor Newman and Bartley who have promised they're going to be very quick.
Thank you, Doug, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, we're not working in an ideal atmosphere for whatever reason, and we're dealing with a problem that's been around for some time and in a way brushed under the carpet. And so, how can we move forward here today? I assume you've seen that the chair's recommendations, A 1, 2, and B 1 to 4, and C. What is the sticking point in terms of we're not going to solve all the problems, outstanding problems today, probably not before the election. So how can we move forward today and get an outcome that is at least both parties can live with? What's the sticking point, and can we work around that?
The sticking point for us is clause B, agree a limited recourse loan. We would like that to read agree a grant.
Thank you. Very clear.
Councillor Newman.
Your interest.
Can we have everyone turn their speakers off except for Councillor Newman?
Earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortisation. You quoted before 6 million, 3.8 million, Doug. Can you indicate whether any other organisation running Stadia in Auckland is achieving an EBITDA result anywhere close to that?
Well, the information that's in the January 19 venue development master strategy suggests there's only one that's just tipped into the positive, and that's Mount Smart.
And can you advise, and this goes back to Councillor Bartley's earlier question, whether any other organisation running Stadia in Auckland has the ability within its working capital, not ratepayers, working capital, to deliver on repairs, maintenance and capital works across its Stadia portfolio?
I don't have the financial data to comment on that, but no, I wouldn't speculate. I don't have the data for that, I'm sorry. It's very difficult to determine in the council accounts just how much support via capital or operating grants go to RFA, but we hear that there is quite a lot, but that's speculation. I don't have any facts.
Yeah, I think it's best not to speculate because the Trust Stadium and the Vodafone Event Centre are run by independent trusts like yourself. So, whoops, what happened? Councillor Bartley?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you. The reason why I asked my questions earlier is my understanding of that particular clause in the trust deed is that the responsibility for capital works, for repairs, refurbishments, is your responsibility. So I'm confused as to why we as council are being asked to fork out 3.2 million for 3 years, when this clearly says it's all your responsibility.
It is our responsibility, which we accept, and we work diligently to deliver on every day in this role. We're not in a financial position to be able to completely fulfill that responsibility right now for reasons that we've traversed today.
Thank you, team. Vicky, Brett, Doug, Nick, you're more than welcome to stay for the rest of the day. Could be into the night, but we're assuming some of you will be staying along. So moved by Councillor Walker, seconded by myself, that we receive and thank you for your presentation. All those in favour? Right, we will ask for Peter Haynes from the local board to come up and